Tenemos ya en conexión a mi admirado Jacques Vallée, que con Paola Harris, que está aquí presencialmente, nos van a presentar su último libro. Seguramente muchos de ustedes han oído hablar de Roswell, han oído hablar del estrellamiento de un platillo volante en el desierto de Nuevo México. Pero pocos saben que hay un incidente mayor, un incidente extraordinario que Paola y Jacques Vallée han estudiado sobre el terreno, porque Paola Harris es periodista de las de raza. Y acaban de publicar un libro que de momento está solo en inglés. Estamos trabajando en la posibilidad de que podamos traducirlo al español, que se llama Incidente Trinity, porque el lugar se llama Trinity o Trinidad. Para situarlos en la escena, vamos a ver un vídeo de 2 minutos. ¿No vídeo? Ah, ok, no vídeo. No vídeo. Porque quien nos va a presentar el vídeo y supongo que todo el trabajo no es otra que Paola Harris.
Gracias, gracias. No, you will see the video. You will see the video at the end because you must see what it takes to do field research. And that's what Jacques and I did. And I did this case, 1945 crash in San Antonio, New Mexico. I did it for 9 years. When I did it for 5 years, and then Jacques and I did it together for 9 years. So you must see the video because you must see the location. For me, as a journalist, I need to do field research, which means I need to go to the place. But before I speak about this case, let me thank Robin and all the people involved with the World Congress. Can we give them an applause? And the reason why is because this case is now international. The book Trinity, and it's called Trinity because that is the place where the atomic bomb exploded. The word Trinity is very powerful. The book itself is in Italian, French, Spanish, and English, and it's on Amazon, and it is revolutionary because it says there was a crash before Roswell, 1 month after the atomic bomb exploded. And how do we know that? Because when I was living in Italy, I read about 2 little children, Indian children, but they were not Indian, they were Hispanic, who had seen this craft come in, hit a radio tower, and land. It did not explode. Remy Baca was 6 years old. Jose Padilla was 9 years old. They were on Jose Padilla's land, acreage. It was cattle ranch. They saw the craft. They went up to the craft. They saw a hole. They saw 3 little beings going back and forth. They went back and told Jose's father, who called the sheriff, Apodaca. The next day they went back to the crash. The father and Sheriff Apodaca went inside the craft. This has never happened. They went inside the craft. And then they saw the army clean up the area. And the army went to the father and said, we need to cut your fence. because we are taking out a weather balloon. They knew it was not a weather balloon because Jose and his father had collected weather balloons and returned them to the army. Yeah. Okay. So they knew it was not a weather balloon. And so the army, because it was the first crash. Now, the bomb exploded July 16th, 1945. It was not a test. Jacques will tell you, it was not a test. It was a bomb. They did not tell the people. So the trajectory of the radiation was 150 miles. It affected the family of Jose Padilla. His mother opened the door and she was blinded in one eye. It affected all the animals. It affected the town of San Antonio. But please remember, this affected the planet because we had discovered nuclear. We had discovered the nuclear capability of a bomb. And this catches the attention of someone. So it is logical that we would have a situation 1 month, almost to the day, on August 16, 1945. That vehicle crash landed 1 month later. Why this is even more important than Roswell is we have the testimony of watching the crash. Roswell doesn't have that. We have the testimony of seeing beings alive going back and forth. And I know you want to know what they look like. Jacques will tell you. And another thing is that they watched the recovery for 8 days. The little boys were on the hill watching the recovery 8 days. What's amazing is that we can actually have the testimony of the two men today because this happened, and they waited till the last day when this craft was put on a truck. It was lifted up and put on a truck, and the 9-year-old went inside the craft and pulled out a piece from the wall. And that piece is with Jacques Vallée at Stanford. We have the location, the witnesses, and going inside the 9-year-old pulling a piece from the wall. That is not in any case of ufology, because Roswell does not have the witnesses seeing the crash. They have a lot of stories of what happened later, but these two little boys, and I found a third witness, the niece of Jose Padilla, was 7 years old, at the very end. That's why, it takes 9 years. I was working on it for 5 years when Jacques found out that there was metal that the boy had picked from. He came in and he came with me at least 6 times to Socorro, New Mexico to question the witness and to see the location. So the thing is that we have all of these elements. Now, I told Jacques, and I'm very impressed with Avile saying that science should get involved. Jacques is a scientist. So when I was doing this, it was just a journalist. It was just a researcher. It was just an investigator. And I put it in my books. But when I have a scientist with me, and when the scientist does the science, and we did do it, so the book is revolutionary. We did do the science, and he will talk about this. We have turned the page in research. We have turned the page in ufology. We have changed things. It is not just gossip and hearsay. We have my interviews, and we have Jacques Vallée's science. And for you people, Jacques Vallée was represented in Steven Spielberg's movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He was the French researcher in that. And the irony is that I began my career when I saw Close Encounters in 1980, and then I went to see Dr. Joseph Allen Hynek, J. Allen Hynek, and I worked with him for 6 years. So I began with an astronomer, science. Then, now, in my career, 40 years later, I work with also an astronomer and also with a scientist. And they were both in the movie Close Encounters. They both had to do with the movie Close Encounters. So my life is a series of coincidences. It's serendipity. It came to me, the story, everything came to me. I did not look for it. And may I encourage you to turn the page and not separate everything, but join it together. For me, I will end by saying this was a gift to humanity, because those beings knew that once we discovered the atomic bomb, this planet would change, that we would become maybe more warlike, more dangerous to them because of our nuclear capabilities. So when this happened, there is a definite message for humanity. As I always kid around and say, I don't think whoever is flying there is on vacation. There is definite agenda and there's a definite message. I would like Jacques to take it over because he is consented from San Francisco where he lives. He works also in Silicon Valley. He was, if you study his, he was in the early ARPANET or the early internet and is very interested in all kinds of modern technology, artificial intelligence, and so forth. So it was an honor for me to be able to do the work and have science come in, which is what Avialab was saying. So Jacques Vallée did go and look at his email box. As Avialab mentioned, scientists should start looking at their email box. So Jacques, if you want to take this over, you go ahead and explain what's happening.
Well, in the life of any scientist, there are some special occasions, some special cases that are most important and that throw a light on an entire field of research. As you may know, I have been doing research on UFOs for a long time, first in France and then in other countries in Europe. And then I had the opportunity, like Paola, to work with Dr. Hynek, who was, as you probably know, the scientist involved in Project Blue Book of the American Air Force. And my background has been in astrophysics and in computer science. So my main interest was in talking to witnesses at the site, getting their testimony, and then trying to find correlations between what they had seen and what many other people had seen all over the world. And so I became, of course, interested in the crashes in New Mexico. There were many reports. The reports were difficult for a scientist to work with because in many cases, nobody had actually seen the object arrive. People would have heard stories about something. They would come to the site. The army would be around the site. The army would take out the object, and people would be left with stories and rumors, it was very difficult for a scientist to verify the information. So Dr. Hynek and I were very discouraged about those cases because there wasn't any data or any samples that we could take physically to the laboratory to study. I became interested again about 2 years before I met Paola, 2 years before this case, because there were other cases in New Mexico where we could find samples. So with a small team of scientists, mostly from Stanford University in California and other places, we started going to these sites and collecting data that we could, in fact, take into the laboratory. And that intrigued me very much, and through a friend of mine whose family was from New Mexico, I heard about the case in San Antonio, the case that Paola was researching. So at that point, I contacted Paola because it seemed that that case was unique. It was unique, as Paola just explained, in several respects. It is unique in space, in the place where it happened, which is about 25 or 30 kilometers from the site of the first atomic bomb. It was also unique because it took place within just a few weeks of the explosion of the atomic bomb. And that is the amazing thing about this case, that everybody has missed it except Paola. Paola was the only one who actually located the witnesses and called them and interviewed them about 9 years ago. Between 1945 and about 2010 or 2008, there was nothing. There was practically no information about the case, only a few rumors. There are a couple of good books that mention the case in passing, but really with no detail. So Paola had done the pioneering work there, and this was obviously, to me, the most interesting case of recovery of a complete object. What happened was that the two children, 7-year-old and 9-year-old, were taking care of a very large ranch in New Mexico that had cattle. And remember that those days were the end of World War II. The armistice had just been signed in Europe, but all the adults were in uniform. They were in Europe, they were in the Pacific, they were all over the world. So children had the responsibility to take care of the property and to take care of the cattle, of the animals. They were there taking care of a cow that had just given birth to a calf. They found the baby calf. They reported on what they had found. They also inspected the fences around the ranch. They were in charge of that. They had binoculars that were very powerful binoculars, so they could keep track of the animals by the brand on the side, on the hide of the animals, of the cattle. So they were well equipped. They knew that area very well, and then the object arrives. The object arrived literally over their heads. It hit a communication tower that controlled communication for the north end of the ranch where the atomic bomb had been exploded. The ranch is called White Sands. It's a very, very large area of desert where the United States was secretly developing the bomb and testing it. Paola mentioned that the explosion was not really a test, because a test in physics means you take a small quantity of something in the lab and you do a reaction, and if the reaction works, then you know that you have discovered an important principle. You cannot do that with an atomic bomb. You cannot take a little atomic bomb. You have to take the bomb itself. And since the project was secret, they did not tell anyone in New Mexico about what the nature of the explosion. Later they realized how destructive the bomb was and how much harm it did to people who were within the range of the explosion. But it took many years before the army recognized that the damage that the bomb had done. The two kids had seen the bomb, they had seen the plume, the mushroom cloud, but nobody had a real idea of the destructive power of that bomb. Japan surrendered 2 days before the crash of this object. And so the historical power of this event is unique. You know, in the life of a scientist like me, there are a few things, as I said, that you always remember, a few things that are unique in your career, in your research. This is one case that is unique in the thousands and thousands and thousands of UFO cases that my colleagues and I have studied, put on the computer, looking for patterns and so on. This case is unique. Why is it not known? All the books about UFOs say the first UFO, the beginning of the recognition of the phenomenon is in June 1947, when Kenneth Arnold, who was a pilot in the state of Washington, saw an object and described it to the press. The case in New Mexico is 2 years before. The words flying saucer did not exist. Nobody called it a flying saucer. In fact, the object was not shaped like a disc. It was not a disc. It was what they called an avocado. Of course, the people in New Mexico spoke Spanish as well as English, so many of the terms that are used in the story are in the Spanish language. When the army came to talk to the family, they spoke Spanish to the family. They didn't speak English. So the case is very important also in terms of the history of the United States, the history of the world, because of all the cultural aspects of that case that we had to learn, both about the culture and about the history of what was happening there. So why was it not known? Roswell is well known. There are other cases in New Mexico and elsewhere, including in Europe and in South America and in Russia, that have become known. Why is this case not known? It's not known because, again, you have to put yourself in the spirit of the end of the big war, of World War II. People had been taught, you don't talk about what you see. You have to keep secrets. And the two kids remembered that, and they were very afraid of what they had seen. They were so afraid of the consequences that they never spoke. They never spoke for about 50 years, more than 50 years. And when they spoke, of course, Paola was the first journalist who really went to interview them in depth and recorded both of their stories and went to the site. There are a few other stories about the case that also are very helpful, but Paola did the major investigation at that time. So I benefited when she invited me into the case. I benefited from all these interviews, and one of the witnesses, one of the kids, had died. The older child, Jose Padilla, Senor Padilla, was still alive. He's still alive now, and we've become friends. We've spoken so many times. I have enormous respect for him. He had a career as a policeman in the United States, in New Mexico, and especially in California, and is now retired. His memory is intact, so he's been able to tell us about what happened during those years. The kids never spoke because they were afraid of the phenomenon, they were afraid of the consequences, and also because, as Paola mentioned, they had taken an object that was inside the avocado, inside the object. The object had crashed over their head after hitting the tower. It was a controlled crash. It's obvious that the object was still under power and that it could still be steered. They were still, the pilots, whoever they were still able to control the landing. The object hit the ground and continued to create a long avenue down the hill, and then it made a turn under power and it stopped. So this is not just a crash. The object didn't break up into many pieces. The object kept its integrity, which is very important because now we have the educated testimony of two witnesses at the site. So when people read our book in the United States, of course, many people are skeptical, and they have every right to be skeptical, especially scientists. And they say, well, you know, two little children, they are telling their story now. How do you know that it's not just a fantasy? Well, we know that because, number one, there are traces. Number two, we have the object that they retrieved from inside and it's very strange. And then we have two other witnesses, adult witnesses, that Paola was able to find. The first one is an army pilot. So remember, 1945, America did not have an air force. There were airplanes, of course, but the airplanes were under the army. So the pilots wore army uniforms. The pilots were with the army. The American Air Force was created 2 years later, in 1947. So we have to relearn a bit of history to really understand what is completely unique about that case. This pilot was coming in from a test flight with a bomber, with a B-29, and the communication tower from the airport at Alamogordo, which is inside the White Sands, asked him to look at the communication tower that had been destroyed. The tower was still standing, but it had no communication anymore. And that tower was very important because it guided airplanes over the north range of the military zone of White Sands, where the atom bomb had been exploded. So it was an important communication tower. So this pilot, whose name was Brody, B-R-O-T-H-Y, made a circle over the tower, described that the tower had been bent, and that's why it couldn't communicate anymore. And then he saw the two little boys on horseback. They had horses to move around the ranch. He saw them, and he saw the object, and he described that, and we have his testimony to the army. So we know that this pilot was a very good observer, and he saw the whole thing just after the crash. The bushes were on fire. The object was not on fire, but the bushes were on fire when it landed, and he could see the smoke, and he described all that to the army before he landed. We have another testimony because we have a third witness from that same family, Sabrina Padilla, who knew the place where this happened. She came in later to join the family as she was growing up, and she could describe to us. She knew, of course, Jose Padilla, who was her uncle, and she knew the objects that they had retrieved from the crash itself. There were 3 other types of physical objects, or material objects, with very, very interesting physical properties. And this is where our small scientific team is continuing to do the research on the case. So we are just at the beginning of a very important piece of research. Roswell happened 2 years later, and this case throws an important light on Roswell. It actually makes Roswell more credible, and Roswell is very important. But at Roswell, there were no witnesses when the object came down. Here we have the witnesses. We have actually 4 witnesses, including 2 adults and 2 children. And we continue to discover more indications about what happened there physically. The only time when I had a dispute with Paola was when I started asking questions about how many. The army came in with a truck, and I wanted to know how many wheels there were on the truck. And Paola would tell me, why do you need to know that? I mean, what's important is the avocado, and how did it fly, and what was the propulsion, and what are the kids saying? Well, I need to count the tire on the truck, because that will tell me the weight of the object. You know, it could have been an experimental weather balloon of a particular type. Well, from the type of truck that the army brought in, which was a very heavy tractor trailer with what they call a lowboy, a big platform with many wheels, we can estimate that the object weighed about 4.5 tons, between 4.5 and 5 tons. So this was, in fact, a very complex, very advanced flying object. On the last day, the 2 witnesses, the 2 children, were very interested to look at the object and touch it, because it was now resting on the truck. The army had brought a crane to lift that avocado and to put it on the truck sideways. They had to put it sideways because it was too large to go under the underpass of the highway if it had been standing up. So they put it on the side, on the platform, on the trailer truck. And then the military was ready to go. They went off to dinner, and the truck was left alone in in the wilderness, in the field. So the two children approached it, and that is the time when Jose Padilla went inside. They also could look at the underside of the object. This is where the propulsion would be. The object was the size of 2 trucks, was very large. It was about 25 feet, almost 10 meters long and over 3 meters high. There was the inside had a flat platform, a flat floor, and the propulsion must have been under the floor. But there was very little room under the floor. And there was no opening. When they looked at the underside of the object, they could not see any opening. The object was smooth, both inside and outside. There were no nails or no screws. There were no rivets. They could not understand how that object was built. It was very strong. Remember, it had to be very strong because when it hit the tower, it did not explode. There was one panel that was ejected that was full of strange filaments, little silvery threads that the kids used as ornament for Christmas that year. Those filaments were like silver filaments. And when Sabrina experimented with them in darkness in her room, those filaments would glow. There was light in those filaments. It was not fiber optic, as we know fiber optic. It was conducting light even several years after the crash, after the recovery of these objects. So in our book, we give all the detail about all the objects that were recovered at that time, and also some of the details about the bracket that Mr. Padilla recovered. The bracket is not, when you look at it, it looks like a human device, and it may be a human device. My hypothesis is that the Army needed that bracket to wrap up a wire, an electrical wire, when they were working inside the object, cleaning it up or measuring it. And so it would be logical that the object would look like a human device. I have a device like it here that Paola bought in a store. It looks like this, and it has an axis. It can turn around this axis, and it's called, in English, it's called an actuator, and you would find it in a windmill, you would find it in pumps, you would find it in many industrial devices. What is strange about the one that was recovered from the craft is that it's entirely in the metric system. Now, Mexico used a metric system, but the United States, the Army, did not use a metric system. So it was not an Army device. It was, we don't know why it was there. It was attached to a panel that was fixed to the wall of the craft. So these are all the things we are investigating now with a small team of scientists and metallurgists, and we are analyzing the metal and analyzing all the data that we can get from the testimony of both Sabrina Padilla and Jose Padilla. The question is, there has been a lot of research done about crashes and about the records. There are records about Roswell from the Army, and those records have been studied by many of our colleagues, many ufologists, like Stanton Friedman, for example, has written several very good books about Roswell and about other crashes. There are people continuing to do research in New Mexico, like Mr. Jacques Wade, for example, who lives in New Mexico and has researched 5 different sites in New Mexico where there have been crashes. This case was unknown. So where did it go? When the object was recovered, and remember the kids watched every day of the recovery by the Army. So they've given us a very complete detail about what the Army did the first day, the second day, the third day, and so on. And we have that record. But it doesn't show up anywhere in the books about UFOs. Well, remember that territory was atomic territory. It was classified. It was under the control of the Army. It was under control of Project Manhattan that developed the atomic bomb. The object would have been taken to one of the atomic laboratories. And the atomic laboratories in the United States have a different system of secrecy. Those are the atomic secrets, not the normal secrets that go, confidential, secret, top secret, and then above top secret. There is another line of secrets that are the diplomatic secrets that are kept by the State Department and by the diplomats. But there is a third system of secrecy, which is the atomic secrets. And I know a number of people in technology that I've worked with who had secret access, secret clearances. They have never heard of this particular case because the case was classified in an area where they had no access because they were not nuclear scientists. You don't give nuclear secrets to a physicist who is working on a new microscope. Those are 2 completely different areas. So the atomic secrets have been kept by the Atomic Energy Commission and now by the Department of Energy. And here we have another proof of that the 2 children are telling us something that really happened, because we know that in the files of the Atomic Energy Commission, there is a report about this particular case. That report was shown to Remy Baca, one of the kids, the younger kid, when he grew up and he became a businessman in the state of Washington. He knew a principal politician in the state of Washington who was the governor of Washington, who became the director of the Department of Energy, and she showed him the report about the case. So we actually have 5 different ways to prove that the case really happened. Now, the question that many of our friends in ufology are going to ask, which is a good question, is how come this case seems to be unique? The shape was the shape of an avocado. It was not a flying saucer, or it was not a triangle. The beings themselves were humanoid. When I studied the transcripts of the very good interviews that Paola had done, and in the transcript, the 2 witnesses describe the beings that they saw inside the craft, sometimes as creatures, sometimes as little men. And I asked Mr. Padilla, were they little men? If they were little men, why do you call them creatures? And he said, well, they were small. They were about as tall as the kids. about 1 meter and 20 centimeters. So the size of a 10-year-old kid. They had a large face. The face was as large as the shoulders. They had 2 eyes, a small nose, a small mouth. They were dressed in gray coveralls, but they could breathe our air. They did not have, a mask or a helmet. They had no respiratory system. So they were creatures that breathed the air. They seemed to be very afraid. They stayed inside the object. This is on the first day when the 2 kids were able to approach it. We don't know what happened to them after that. They may have been removed by the army. They may have been collected by other beings from another object somewhere. But anyway, they were not there in the following days. But the kids had a good chance to look at them and to describe them on the first day, the day of the crash. It turns out that in my research, I've done very extensive research on 2 other cases that are official cases. One is an official case of Project Blue Book of the US Air Force in Socorro, New Mexico. Socorro is about 10 or 11 kilometers north of the Padilla case. An object crashed there, landed there, it didn't crash. It landed there, left traces, and then took off again in 1964. And it was investigated by Dr. Hynek, and I helped in the investigation. The investigation was by the police of New Mexico, by the investigators from the Air Force, and by people from the FBI who were in town in Socorro looking at a crime case, but they were available to help in studying the traces from the Socorro landing. I will show you what the object in Socorro looked like. So I hope that you can see it. So this is the Padilla object that we talked about. This is the object in Socorro. As you can see, it's almost the same size. It's the same shape. It has 3 landing legs. And then there was a case in France that I investigated also in Valençol on August 1st, 1965. I've been to Valençol. I have spoken to the witness, to the main witness. Valençol is a fairly complex case, but in all 3 cases, the object was not a disc. It was an oval, as you just saw, of about the same size. It was the size of a truck. The case in New Mexico was a crash, but the other 2 cases were landings in Socorro and in Valençol, and the object took off and went away. It went away very fast. You could not follow it, you could not track it. In all 3 cases, the beings are small, the size of a 10-year-old kid. They are humanoid in terms of the shape of their head and the features of their head. They have 2 eyes, 1 little nose, 1 little mouth, and they can breathe our air. So it's not a case of that it's just one story. It's one of 3 very solid stories. The case in Valençol was investigated by 5 different agencies of the French government, including the customs, including the Air Force, including the gendarmerie, including the army, and so on. So there is a lot of evidence, a lot of testimony about the case. There were traces that have been examined by scientists in France, and of course the same thing in Socorro, which was a case studied by the Air Force and the FBI. So we have a convergence of evidence on these three cases, and the case where we have the best information is the case that Paola has discovered and has brought to us. So I think we have time for questions. There are, of course, a case like that raises many questions. So I'll be happy if you have some questions. I know it's getting late for you in Barcelona. It's about lunchtime here in San Francisco, but I'm not terribly hungry. I'm more motivated to discuss a case with you.
Thank you, Jacques Vallée. Un aplauso. Bueno, el caso es impresionante y no sé si alguien quiere formular una pregunta a mi amigo Sergio.
Paola, do you have anything to add to what I said?
Hello, Mr. Vallée. It's a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you, Paola, for your permission. I have a question. I spoke before with Paola Harris. These kids have had a telepathic conversation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Paola.
It's a very interesting question because so on the day of the crash, the two kids, remember, again, you have to think of the end of World War II. Everybody understands that if an airplane crashes or if there is an accident, and you're the first on the scene, you have to immediately help the people who may have been hurt. So everybody, I remember in France, I grew up during World War II in France. And I remember that, people were getting injured, people were getting scared. I saw my parents, would immediately try to help the people around them. So the kids know that. So the first idea is that it was some sort of airplane. Remember, they had no concept of a UFO. I mean, there had never been stories about UFOs. So they thought it was some military thing that had crashed, and they should help because it was on their land. So they rushed there thinking we're going to help some wounded people, and we're going to call for help from the town. And they stop because they see that the beings don't seem to be hurt. They are running inside the object, but they don't actually walk. They just slide up and down inside the object, and they can see that through the opening in the avocado. And they don't approach, they are afraid of approaching them because they don't look human. They don't look completely human. And the beings are not looking at them, but they seem to be aware of them. So there is no telepathic communication in the sense of the being looking at them and transmitting a message. But they have images that come into their head. The images are terrifying. There are images of buildings being destroyed. There are images of things falling from the sky with lots of clouds, lots of smoke. And in fact, both of them will have dreams that are coming back, recurring dreams for several years after the crash, after the sighting.
Okay.
And it's always the same dream. And then after a while, the dream didn't happen as often anymore. But Mr. Padilla told me, I asked him that question. Mr. Padilla told me that for 2 or 3 years, as he was growing up, he would have these recurring dreams. Something would be happening, coming down, and then he would wake up. The dream would always force him to wake up.
Thank you, Mr. Vallée.